The year was 1940. The world was teetering on the edge of an all-out war, and Britain, under the crushing weight of German air assaults, was desperate. The Luftwaffe had torn through Europe like a storm, unstoppable, methodical, and devastating. London, the heart of the British Empire, stood on the brink of annihilation. Bombs fell every night, and yet, through the smoke and fire, the Royal Air Force, RAF, remained defiant. But they were fighting with outdated aircraft, planes that had once been kings of the sky, but now seemed more like the last bastion of a fading age. And then came the hurricane. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most agile, and it certainly wasn't the best in any category when compared to its adversaries. But the hurricane, despite being Britain's least impressive fighter by all technical standards, was about to become something much greater. It was going to become a legend. On August 13th, 1940, the Battle of Britain began in earnest. The skies above Britain were filled with the deafening roar of engines and the blinding flash of tracers. The Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of bombers, protected by their fighters, seeking to crush Britain's will to fight. The RAF was stretched thin, and their fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires, were outnumbered. The Spitfire was the crown jewel of the RAF. Sleek, fast, and agile, it was the fighter that every pilot wanted to fly. But the Hurricane, the lesser-known workhorse of the Battle of Britain, would prove that sometimes the unsung hero is the one that wins the war. The Hurricane, designed as a sturdy, reliable monoplane, had seen service since 1937, and although it was eclipsed by the more advanced Spitfire, it still had its virtues. The Hurricane was rugged, able to take damage and keep flying. It was a tank in the sky, able to endure what most aircraft couldn't. But in the early days of the Battle of Britain, many considered it obsolete. Its performance was overshadowed by the Spitfire's superior speed and agility. Even its pilots, often pilots who were veterans of earlier campaigns, questioned its place in the Air Force. At RAF Biggin Hill, one such pilot, Squadron Leader Jeffrey Wellings, sat in the cockpit of his Hurricane, looking out at the horizon. The day was bleak, with clouds rolling in from the English Channel. It was just after dawn, and already he could hear the faint hum of enemy aircraft approaching. "Well, Jeffrey, here we go again," Wellings muttered to himself. He hadn't seen a day like this in months. The Germans were relentless, and the RAF's numbers were dwindling. The Spitfires were often engaged first, leaving the Hurricanes to pick up the slack. Wellings, a seasoned veteran, had flown through the skies of France before, but this felt different. There was no room for error now. The outcome of the war seemed to rest on the shoulders of a handful of men and their aging aircraft. The alarm bell sounded. Wellings pushed the throttle forward, the Hurricane's engine roared to life, and he took to the skies, joining a group of Hurricanes on patrol. Below them, the channel was dotted with the silhouettes of incoming bombers. As the bombers neared, Wellings and his squadron closed in. They fired their cannons, tearing into the bombers' wings. But the German fighters didn't back down. They fought back with precision, their sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s darting in and out of the clouds, firing at anything that moved. Wellings engaged one of the 109s, his Hurricane vibrating with each burst of cannon fire. He tracked the enemy plane, his sights aligning perfectly with its tail. With a quick squeeze of the trigger, the 109 erupted in a burst of flames, spiraling to the earth below. "Well done, Wellings," came the voice over the radio. But it wasn't just Wellings who was making a difference. Every Hurricane in the squadron was contributing. They weren't the fastest nor the most nimble, but they were relentless. The Germans learned quickly that the Hurricane wasn't just a slow, cumbersome target. It could hit hard, and it could take a hit, too. The first wave of bombers was disrupted. The Hurricanes had made their mark, saving British lives, slowing the German advance, and forcing the Luftwaffe to rethink their strategy. But this was just the beginning. The Battle of Britain had only just begun, and Britain's so-called worst fighter was about to prove it wasn't just a fighter. It was the backbone of an entire defense. In the weeks that followed, the Hurricanes would go on to claim the majority of victories for the RAF. In fact, more German planes were shot down by Hurricanes than by Spitfires during the battle, and as the weeks passed, the Hurricane's reputation grew, as it proved time and again that its rugged durability and steady firepower could take down the most advanced aircraft in the sky. But while the Hurricane was winning the battle in the air, there was another battle being fought on the ground, a battle for respect. The Spitfire, with its sleek, aerodynamic lines and superior performance, was the star. It was the aircraft that everyone talked about, the aircraft that was glamorous and powerful. The Hurricane, on the other hand, was humble. It didn't have the speed or the grace of the Spitfire, but what it did have was something that couldn't be measured by technical specifications. It had heart, and it had the will to win. By the time the Battle of Britain ended in October 1940, the Hurricane had proven itself as one of the most effective and reliable fighters in the sky. It had played a key role in Britain's victory, and its pilots had become legends. They didn't care about the accolades. They didn't care that the Spitfire was the one getting all the attention. They cared about the job at hand, and they did it with everything they had. But the legacy of the Hurricane didn't end in 1940. As the war raged on, the Hurricane would continue to serve with distinction, flying over Europe, North Africa, and even the Far East. It would be the plane that kept flying when others had given up, and by the time the war ended, the Hurricane had become one of the most respected fighters of World War II, earning its place in history, not as Britain's worst fighter, but as its most dependable. But how did the Hurricane, once considered obsolete, become so much more? How did this unassuming fighter earn its place in the annals of aviation history? The answers lie not in speed, but in endurance, not in glamour, but in guts, not in its technical superiority, but in its ability to adapt when the odds were stacked against it. In Part 2, we'll explore how the Hurricane became the weapon of choice for the RAF and its pilots, how this once-forgotten aircraft became the foundation of Britain's defense and an unbreakable symbol of resilience. The dawn of October 1940 marked the end of the Battle of Britain, a victory that had kept the Luftwaffe at bay. But the war was far from over, and the Hurricane's fight was just beginning. The world had witnessed a historical moment. The Hurricane, often dismissed as inferior to its more glamorous counterpart, the Supermarine Spitfire, had held the line. It was Britain's workhorse, its unheralded guardian in the skies. But to those who flew it, the Hurricane was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of survival, grit, and raw determination. After the Battle of Britain, the RAF's leadership shifted its focus to the next phase of the war, the bombing campaign over Europe. The Luftwaffe had failed to break Britain, but now it was Britain's turn to take the fight to the Germans. And the Hurricane was ready, but not without growing pains. The RAF's shift in strategy, away from dogfights over the English Channel to long-range bombing raids, meant that the Hurricane had to evolve. The fighter had to be adapted for new missions, pushing its capabilities beyond the confines of the Battle of Britain. While the Spitfire was known for its speed and agility, the Hurricane was the real bomber escort fighter, a sturdy, reliable platform that could take damage and keep flying. The Hurricanes were now tasked with defending the bombers on their perilous raids over Nazi-occupied Europe. The role was grueling, dangerous, and demanded a fighter that could endure, and the hurricane endured. Despite being overshadowed by the Spitfire's superior agility, the hurricane's real strength was its robustness. During these raids, where British bombers faced intense German fighter opposition, the hurricane proved itself time and again. While the Spitfire may have outmaneuvered its foes, the hurricane could absorb punishment and keep flying. The hurricane's durability was not just physical. It was built into the very essence of the RAF's tactics. The plane's versatility allowed it to take on multiple roles, from ground attack missions in North Africa to its iconic role as a bomber escort over the continent. But the real turning point in the hurricane's rise to legend status came during Operation Torch in November 1942. This was the Allies' first major offensive against the Axis powers in North Africa, and the hurricane would play a pivotal role in this campaign. The rugged terrain of the North African deserts tested the limits of every aircraft, and the hurricane, with its reinforced frame, would prove more than capable. The desert climate, harsh and unforgiving, presented its own set of challenges. Sandstorms, scorching heat, and the constant threat of enemy aircraft in the skies over North Africa demanded a fighter that could perform consistently despite the odds. The hurricane was that fighter. But it wasn't just the mechanics of the plane that made it stand out. It was the men who flew it. Squadron leader Johnny Johnson, one of the RAF's most decorated pilots, found himself in North Africa in 1942, flying a Hurricane against German and Italian aircraft. Johnson would become an icon of the Hurricane, scoring numerous kills while flying the unassuming fighter that had once been overshadowed by the Spitfire. Johnny Johnson's success was proof of what the Hurricane could do. It wasn't about the flash of a high-speed dogfight or the sleekness of a cutting-edge fighter. The Hurricane was about getting the job done. It was about endurance, and in the deserts of North Africa, that endurance was tested daily. With the skies constantly filled with enemy aircraft, Johnson and his squadron used the Hurricane's steady firepower to keep the Axis at bay. In these battles, the Hurricane was far from the worst fighter. It was the unsung hero, quiet, reliable, and relentless. The very characteristics that had once made it the underdog in Britain's aerial defense now made it the perfect weapon for the war in Africa. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Spitfire continued to receive the lion's share of attention. But as the war raged on and the demands on the RAF grew, the true value of the Hurricane became undeniable. It wasn't glamorous, but it had something that could not be measured on paper: versatility. By the time 1943 rolled around, the Hurricane had not only earned its place in history but had secured a legacy that would inspire future generations of pilots and engineers. The Hurricane was no longer just the worst fighter. It had become the embodiment of Britain's wartime resilience. As the war progressed, the Hurricane would also serve in the Far East, where it would take on even more diverse roles. Flying over the jungles of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, the Hurricane proved that it wasn't just suited for the skies over Europe and Africa. It was a global force, capable of adapting to any challenge thrown its way. But despite all the accolades, the Hurricane's true legacy was not built on kill counts or statistics. It was built on the lives saved, the bombers escorted home safely, and the pilots who trusted it with their lives. It was the backbone of the RAF's air defense, a testament to the power of practicality over theory, of reliability over flash. And yet, despite this, the Hurricane's legacy remained overshadowed by the Spitfire's fame. The Spitfire was sleek, fast, and its name became synonymous with British defiance in the air. The Hurricane, by contrast, was often relegated to a supporting role, never receiving the glory it truly deserved. But in the hearts of those who had flown it, the hurricane was never just a supporting actor. It was the hero of the skies. The hurricane's greatest strength was its ability to keep fighting. It wasn't the best at anything, but it was good enough at everything. It was versatile, adaptable, and could take a beating and still come back for more. It was the perfect reflection of the RAF during the darkest days of the war, tough, relentless, and never willing to give up. The hurricane's place in history was secure, not because it was the fastest or the most advanced, but because it was the one that fought through it all. And when the war finally came to an end in 1945, the hurricane had proven itself as one of the most valuable fighters of World War II, earning the respect of every pilot who had flown it, and of those who had flown against it. In the annals of aviation history, the hurricane's legacy would never be forgotten. It had gone from Britain's worst fighter to one of the most trusted and revered aircraft of the war. In Part 3, we will explore the aftermath of the hurricane's rise, its impact on the war effort, and how it became the unexpected legend that continues to inspire aviation enthusiasts today. As 1943 unfolded, the hurricane, once considered a relic, had cemented its place as a cornerstone of the Royal Air Force's success in multiple theaters of war. From the skies over Britain to the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of the Far East, the hurricane had proven itself more than just a fighter. It had become the workhorse of the RAF, a symbol of steadfast resilience, and a fighter that could adapt to any challenge. The impact of the hurricane's versatility on the war effort was immeasurable. It had been the one that held the line during the Battle of Britain, and it would continue to serve in countless campaigns where its rugged design and adaptability allowed it to outperform more sophisticated but less reliable aircraft. In North Africa, it became the favored aircraft for ground attack missions. The desert was a harsh environment, and the hurricane's durability made it ideal for flying at low altitudes, strafing Axis supply lines and troop positions. The hurricanes often worked in conjunction with British and Commonwealth ground forces, providing vital close air support. But even as they faced the fierce German and Italian air forces, the hurricane's reliability under pressure kept the RAF at the forefront of the battle. The hurricane's greatest contribution to the war was arguably in its role as a fighter bomber. Its ability to carry bombs, rockets, and machine guns transformed it into a multi-role aircraft, one that could attack enemy targets on the ground, protect bombers from enemy interceptors, and still hold its own in dogfights. While the Spitfire was often seen as the more glamorous fighter, it was the hurricane that held the most significant share of responsibility for Britain's success in the air. But the true measure of the hurricane's legend wasn't just in its combat record. It was in its ability to evolve with the demands of a changing war. As the conflict expanded into new regions and new battles, the hurricane kept pace. It proved that flexibility was just as important as innovation in modern warfare. By 1943, the Hurricane Mk2 had emerged as the primary version of the aircraft. This updated model was equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that gave it enhanced performance, allowing it to carry heavier loads and operate at higher altitudes. Its armament was upgraded and its systems were improved. The Hurricane was no longer just a stopgap. It was a versatile, reliable aircraft that could take on a variety of roles with effectiveness. However, it was the Eastern Front that truly solidified the Hurricane's place in aviation history. The RAF deployed Hurricanes to defend British-held territories in Burma and fight against the Japanese. In the unforgiving terrain of Southeast Asia, where the conditions were extreme and the threat from enemy aircraft and ground forces was constant, the Hurricane excelled. The aircraft was used in ground attacks against Japanese supply lines, strafing enemy positions with its deadly cannon and machine guns, all while withstanding the heat and humidity that had often grounded other planes. The most iconic missions came during the Japanese invasion of Burma. As Japanese fighters like the A6M-0 dominated the skies, the Hurricane faced a new type of adversary. These Zeros were far more agile than the heavy Hurricanes, but they lacked the durability and firepower of the British fighter. The Hurricane's slow but steady tactics, its ability to take on multiple targets, its sturdy frame, and its bomb-carrying capability made it an invaluable asset in the battle for control of Burma. In Burma, Hurricanes would find themselves flying in support of ground troops in some of the most harrowing conditions of the war. They would attack Japanese positions, provide air cover for British forces, and in doing so, they demonstrated an adaptability that few other aircraft could match. It wasn't just on the battlefield that the Hurricane's legend was built. It was also in the hearts of the pilots who flew it. These men, many of whom were from the Commonwealth, had joined the RAF to fight for Britain in a war that was quickly becoming a global struggle. They came from all walks of life, from farm boys in Canada to mechanics from Australia to students from New Zealand. They found a camaraderie in the Hurricane, a bond forged not in the aircraft's performance but in its ability to get them home. And yet, despite its success, the Hurricane never achieved the fame of the Spitfire. The Spitfire, with its graceful design and high-speed capabilities, would become the poster child of the Battle of Britain. It was the Spitfire that graced the covers of magazines and the pages of history books. But the Hurricane's contribution was no less significant. In fact, many historians would argue that without the Hurricane, Britain might not have survived the Battle of Britain at all. Its role was as vital as it was humble. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the Hurricane's service came to an end. The aircraft was retired from frontline duties and replaced by newer, faster designs. The jet age was dawning, and the Hurricane, with its piston engine and propellers, was no longer the weapon of choice for modern combat. But the Hurricane's legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had flown it. It was the aircraft that had stood between Britain and destruction. It had fought in the Battle of Britain. It had supported ground forces in Africa, and it had flown over the jungles of Burma. It had been the one to get the job done when it mattered most. The Hurricane had proven that sometimes the worst fighter wasn't the one that won. It was the one that had the heart to keep going, no matter what. In the years after the war, the Hurricane was largely forgotten by the public. Its legacy was overshadowed by the fame of the Spitfire, but for those who had flown it, the Hurricane would forever remain their true hero. It was the fighter that had won the war, not with speed or style, but with a determination that had defined Britain's wartime spirit. The Hurricane was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of perseverance, of survival, and of the unyielding will to succeed in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the fighter that refused to give up, and in doing so, became one of the most important aircraft of the Second World War. In Part 4, we'll explore the Hurricane's, then just his victory in that one fight. His actions had sparked a shift in the way that military strategists and pilots thought about aerial combat. It wasn't about having the fastest aircraft or the most advanced technology. McConnell's victory proved that human ingenuity, adaptability, and courage were just as important as speed and firepower. In the months that followed the battle, McConnell was called in by his superiors for a series of debriefings. They wanted to know everything from his decision-making process to his thoughts on the Me-262's vulnerabilities. He explained, in the simplest terms, that his success had come from not trying to match the jet's speed, but to use its predictability against it. He had focused on the strengths of his P-51 Mustang, its maneuverability and its ability to force the Me-262 into a situation where it was at its weakest. It wasn't about trying to outrun the jet, McConnell had said in one of the briefings. It was about putting myself in the right position to intercept it at the right moment. The more McConnell spoke, the more he realized how significant this shift in thinking was. Jet fighters like the Me-262 had redefined the future of air combat, yet McConnell's victory proved that courage and experience could still play a decisive role. The jet age had arrived, but it wasn't the only future of aerial warfare. The piston-engine fighters were still relevant, especially when flown by a pilot who understood how to exploit weaknesses in the enemy. The story of McConnell's victory spread through the ranks, and it became a symbol of defiance against seemingly insurmountable odds. While the world was transitioning into an era dominated by jet-powered fighters, McConnell's tale reminded everyone that, at the end of the day, it was the man behind the controls that made all the difference. Even after the war, the legend of McConnell grew. Many pilots in post-war flight schools were taught about his engagement with the Me-262 as an example of how instinct, courage, and knowing your aircraft could change the outcome of any battle. McConnell was invited to speak at numerous events, and in his quiet, unassuming way, he told his story. He spoke of the moments when everything seemed impossible, when he had no choice but to trust in his instincts, his training, and the P-51 Mustang that had carried him through it all. I didn't have a choice that day, McConnell often said. It was either act or be taken out of the sky. I acted. His story became a part of the fabric of aviation history, not because he had achieved the impossible, but because he had redefined what was possible. The myth of the Me-262, the unstoppable jet, had been shattered by a pilot in a propeller-driven Mustang. It was proof that human bravery, even in the face of advanced technology, could still change the course of history. McConnell's place in the legacy of aviation didn't stop at his jet kill. He would go on to mentor countless young pilots, emphasizing the importance of thinking strategically, trusting in their training, and always believing that nothing was impossible. The Me-262 would go down in history as the symbol of the dawn of the jet age. But McConnell's victory would remain a reminder that even in a world of advanced technology, human spirit could still win out. In the decades that followed, McConnell was invited to attend several reunions of the USAAF veterans, where he would share stories of his time in combat and the experiences that shaped his incredible feat. During these reunions, he was often approached by young pilots who had heard the stories of his legendary engagement. They were eager to know more, not just about the mechanics of the battle, but about his mentality, his thought process during those critical moments. "How did you stay calm?" one young pilot asked. McConnell smiled softly. "You don't have time to be afraid. You just do it." His answer was simple, but profound. Courage wasn't something you could plan for. It was something you found in the heat of the moment. McConnell had shown the world that no matter how advanced the technology, the will of the pilot was still the deciding factor in aerial combat. As the years passed, McConnell quietly retired from active service. His name faded from the front-page headlines, but the story of that day, when one man outflew a jet using nothing but courage, remained in the hearts of those who had lived through it. McConnell's story would continue to be passed down to every new generation of aviators, a reminder that the human element could still overcome the odds. In the end, McConnell would be remembered not just as a hero of the skies, but as a man who taught the world that true bravery is not about the weapon you fly, but the courage in your heart. As time passed, the world moved further into the era of jets and missiles. The hurricane became a distant memory for some, a relic of a time long past. But to those who remembered, it remained timeless, a true legend of aviation, and a fighter that had defied the odds when the world needed it most. In 2001, the Royal Air Force marked the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Britain with a memorial flight, a touching tribute to the men and machines that had secured their survival. The Hurricane, alongside the Spitfire, was the star of the show, soaring once again over the skies of Britain. It was a fitting tribute to the aircraft that had made such a difference in the early days of the war. As the years went on, the Hurricane's legacy only grew stronger. It was celebrated not just for its combat record, but for the spirit it represented, the spirit of those who fought not for recognition or glory, but for the survival of their nation. In the grand tapestry of aviation history, the Hurricane will always hold a special place. It wasn't the fastest, the flashiest, or the most advanced. But when Britain needed it most, it delivered. And in doing so, it earned a place as one of the greatest legends of World War II. The Hurricane proved that sometimes being the best isn't about having the most advanced technology. It's about being the one that keeps flying when the world is falling apart. And that, more than anything, is what made the Hurricane a legend. The Hurricane's story continues to inspire today, reminding us all that sometimes the unsung hero is the one who carries the weight when others falter. And that true legend status comes from endurance, resilience, and the quiet courage to keep fighting when the odds are stacked against you.